Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to the second of three lessons this week dealing with the beginnings of the Cold War. Now, in the first lesson, we talked about how World War II leads to the Cold War. We began to look at those divisions between the United States and the Soviet Union, dealing with territory that both were awarded at the Yalta Conference. We begin to see the differing ideas. We represent democracy and capitalism. Of course, the Soviet Union represents communism. And we begin to see this division that's growing. We talked about some terms like the Truman Doctrine and containment, some issues that we're going to touch on today as we continue looking at the beginning of the Cold War. This lesson is going to be a lot about terminology, but you got to understand the terminology before we can get into the actual conflicts, which is what the third lesson this week is going to be about: the Cold War heating up in Asia, specifically in places like Japan, China, and Korea. So let's get started. You are free to take your own notes on this if you want to. I've uploaded a worksheet on Canvas to help you as well. There's going to be a lot of terms, so you might want to use that worksheet to help keep track of everything. There will be a quiz, and it will not be open notes, so be sure you're following along and getting information down. Also, keep in mind, we're going to be in the Cold War for a couple weeks now because the Cold War lasts from 1945, the end of World War II, until 1989, 1990, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So just be prepared. We're going to have a lot to cover between now and. So here we go. Let's review real quickly the two sides that are going to be represented in this conflict. On one side, you've got the West, and the other side, you've got the East. Now, the West is dominated by the United States and Great Britain. Okay, Truman is president here at the beginning. Churchill is prime minister. Of course, on the eastern side, you've got the Soviet Union and its satellites dominated by Stalin. Now, in terms of government, the West prefers democracy with heavy emphasis on individual freedom. The East is totalitarian communism, okay, with no freedom. You have a dictator in charge. Now, what ends up happening is the dictator tends to take over and take power because, remember, in communism, especially the economic side of communism, everybody's supposed to be equal. So you need a totalitarian dictator with all the authority, supposedly, to make sure that everything is allocated equally among everybody. Now, in the West, okay, we would like to do business with the East, okay? It's not that we're opposed doing business with Eastern Europe. In fact, we would love to buy raw materials from Eastern Europe. But under Stalin, Stalin wants complete control of Eastern Europe. He is concerned about another land invasion of the Soviet Union. Okay? He's worried that these Western nations will start doing business with the Eastern European countries. And then the East will want what the West has. And then there's not going to be kind of this buffer zone between him and the West. And maybe the US and Britain and the other Western nations, with the help of these satellites and stuff like that, maybe they would join forces and try to invade the Soviet Union. And Stalin does not want that, okay? He wants complete control over Eastern Europe. We would also like the Eastern European nations to do business with us because we would like markets for our products, not just our products, but British products as well, Western products. We would love to do business with the East because we need raw materials and markets. Again, Stalin doesn't want that. Stalin wants to have complete control over the East because he wants the resources himself. He wants the markets to himself. He wants to rebuild the Soviet Union after World War II. Not that the Soviet Union is in any way destroyed necessarily, but remember, they did have a lot of problems around Stalingrad. He lost a lot of lives and stuff like that. When we talk about rebuilding after the war, that's what we're talking about, okay, is trying to recover from World War II, even though they were on the winning side. Eventually, these divisions become so great, we're not going to be able to overlook them. And that's going to lead us to what we call the Cold War. These divisions lead us to the Cold War. Now, the Cold War is a state of hostility between the two big superpowers. And the two big superpowers that emerge are the United States and the Soviet Union. Okay, by the way, that's what SU stands for, Soviet Union. So while there's this hostility, while there's this tension between these two superpowers, at the same time, there is no actual fighting. Okay, there's no military action between us and the Soviet Union. That's why it's a Cold War. Now, that being said, and we'll talk about this in the next lesson and some lessons afterwards, there are episodes where communist and non-communist forces, and a lot of times the non-communist forces are us, there are episodes where communist and non-communist forces do clash, but we never directly attack the Soviet Union. Soviet Union might be backing those communist forces themselves, but we never actually physically go after the Soviet Union. Again, that's why it's a Cold War. What happens is that each side is trying to spread its political and economic influence worldwide. Both of them are that's their goal, is they want to spread their political and economic influence worldwide. Now, we don't want to see communism spread. The term that we use for that is containment. Okay, containment, we want to contain communism where it is. We don't want to see it spread. One of our first policies of containment is the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine, okay, it's our first test of containment. The Truman Doctrine says that anywhere anyone is fighting communism, we will be there to help. Okay? President Truman argued that we should send aid to any nation trying to stop communism from taking over. Okay? And that's what containment is. We want to stop the spread of communism. So this is just a declaration of containment. Okay? We want to stop communism from taking over. For years, this is going to be our guiding principle in foreign policy. You're going to see a bunch of presidents come back and refer to containment and the Truman Doctrine. Are we helping those countries fighting communism because we don't want communism spreading? Another term that we associate with this is domino theory. Just like with dominoes, when you stack the dominoes in a row or whatever, if you knock one over, the idea is that we'll knock the others. Okay, well, we don't want one nation falling to communism and then causing other nations to fall to communism. We've already seen it with the Soviet Union. We're going to see it. Soviet Union invades China, I take that back. The Soviet Union is going to spread its influence into China. China is going to become communist. We're concerned about this domino theory. It looks like all these nations in Asia are becoming communist. And that's going to get us involved in places like Korea and Vietnam because we're trying to uphold the Truman Doctrine and trying to uphold containment. Now, speaking of getting involved, after World War II, there's this whole battleground that we've got to deal with. And that battleground is Europe, okay? Principally the country of Germany. Germany's been divided. You've got East Germany, which is under the control of the communists, and then you have West Germany, which is shared between us, France, and Britain. Okay, and we talked about that in the last lesson. Those three sections are going to join together. They're going to become democratic. They're going to become capitalist. They're going to be under their own rule. East Germany is going to stay under the communist rule. Okay, and it's going to remain communist. The fear is that communism will spread. How can we stop that communism from spreading in Europe? That's going to lead us to our second policy, the Marshall Plan. Europe is in shambles. It's in ruins after World War II. Okay, it's been destroyed by years of war. And let's be honest with you, it's not just World War II. They were still trying to rebuild from the First World War when the Second World War broke out. So they really have got problems. So we're going to institute something called the Marshall Plan. It's actually like the European Recovery Act or whatever, but most people refer to it as the Marshall Plan, and history remembers it as the Marshall Plan. What we are going to do is the United States is going to send massive financial aid into Europe. We're going to help these countries rebuild. And the idea is if we send all this aid to these countries and we help them rebuild, then who are they going to see as their friend? Us. And who are they not going to want to pay attention to? Soviet Union. And if they're friends with us, then they can't be communist. All right. So we're going to send out all this money. We're going to help Europe rebuild, Western Europe rebuild, and keep those countries on our side and stop the spread of communism. And it works. Okay. I mean, really, it works. We do help Europe rebuild, and Western Europe stays on our side. So we've got a nice barrier here between us and the communists. In fact, we talked in the last presentation, Churchill giving that speech, okay? He talks about the Iron Curtain. Here's the Iron Curtain right there. You can see the division between the capitalist and democratic West and the communist East. There it is right there. There's the Iron Curtain. And it comes from us funneling money into this section right here. Now, we also have talked about there are some organizations that are going to help us with this. It's not just going to be us alone, even though we're the superpower. One is the United Nations. Okay, the United Nations is formed to prevent future global wars. It's replacing the League of Nations. The League of Nations was weak. It had no army, it had no U.S. support. The United Nations does have an army, and it does have U.S. support. In fact, it's going to be headquartered here in the United States in New York. Now, everybody, including the Soviet Union, can be part of the United Nations. Okay? And again, the idea is we need to prevent future global wars because now we've got nuclear weapons. And if one country uses nuclear weapons, then the only way to retaliate is to use more nuclear weapons. And pretty soon, you've blown yourself up. That's called mutually assured destruction. And we want to prevent that. Now, while the UN is doing its thing, at the same time, there's a couple of defensive alliances that emerge. Now, again, everybody can be in the UN, even the Soviet Union. The same is not the case for NATO. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Okay? It's us, Canada, and 10 other Western European nations. This is going to be a defensive military alliance. Now, notice the key word there is defensive. If you're defense, you don't go on the offense, okay? And that's the point, all right? We are not going to go out looking for conflict. But if conflict comes, we're going to be there to join together and stop it, okay? So we're not going to be looking for trouble, but if trouble comes, we're going to have each other's backs. And the idea is we need this to prevent Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Okay? And when we join this group, the idea is an attack on one will be an attack on all, which is why we are so concerned as the Cold War goes on. We're so concerned with what's happening in Western Germany versus Eastern Germany, because if East Germany comes over and attacks the West, we've got this policy, attack on one is attack on all. We're going to have to get involved. And again, the fear is if we get involved and the Soviets are already involved, we have nuclear weapons, they have nuclear weapons, what's going to happen there, okay? So again, we're trying to avoid conflict, okay? That's another reason we want it to be in a defensive alliance. We do not, okay, want to start anything and risk nuclear war. Now today, this map right here shows you 1952, here are kind of the original NATO members. Then by 55, you got the dark blue. Then here is 82. I think Spain comes in 82, 99, Poland, Austria, I think, or Czechoslovakia comes in and stuff. And then by 2004, all these other countries have come in. So today, it kind of looks like this. But that's not how it originally was. Because when we start forming this a defensive alliance, then the Soviet Union is going to get nervous, and the Soviet Union is going to form its own alliance called the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact was a military alliance. And keep in mind, notice, they do not use the term defense here, okay? They make it known this is a military alliance, and if we need to, we will go on the offensive. But it's a military alliance between the Soviet Union and its satellite nations, okay? So again, this division in Europe is setting up some very tense things. We're adding to what we talked about in the last lesson, and we're seeing the differences emerging between us and the West and the Soviets in the east. Now, the last thing, if you're using the worksheet that I gave you, there's a little map there, okay? I want you to color in NATO and the Warsaw Pact, all right? And if you got a red pen, I will use a red pen, and I'll tell you why in just a second. So, on your map, all right, let's start with NATO first, all right? Color in these NATO nations. We've got Britain, we've got France, we've got Portugal, okay, Italy up here. Notice Spain will come in later. There will be other nations that come in later, but color in these countries right here blue. Those are our NATO nations, okay? Or shade them in with a pencil, whatever, okay? Whatever you're using, shade them in and be sure you label them the NATO nations, okay? On the other side, all right, fill in your Warsaw Pact countries. And I like to use red because red is associated with communism, and these countries are communism. So you got the Soviet Union, you got Poland, you got Czechoslovakia, you got East Germany right there, okay, Albania down here, all right. But color in those countries as the Warsaw Pact. And you can see, all right, there's the Iron Curtain that Churchill was talking about. But you can see these two alliances butt up against each other. And you can see why we are so concerned about containment, why we're so concerned about nuclear war with the UN and all kinds of things like that, because these countries are real close together. And if something bad happens, it's going to affect a lot of people. And because we pledged an attack on one is an attack on all, we're going to have to get involved. So we're very much concerned about this division. Now we're going to leave the tension in Europe for a while, and we're going to move over to Asia for our last presentation. And like I said, we're going to talk about the Cold War heating up in Japan, China, and Korea.